Welcome to Gathering at the Table. This month's lesson is over the book of Esther. The book of Esther is in the Old Testament after the book of Nehemiah and before Job and Psalms. It's a fairly short book, but it's one of my favorites. So the book of Esther starts with the king of Persia denouncing his wife. There's a banquet and the king gets really drunk, which is a good start for a book, huh? And while drunk, he demands that his wife Vashti joins him at the banquet so he can show her off to everyone. Vashti, who doesn't want to deal with the king's crap, refuses. Good for her. But the king gets mad at her and exiles her. After exiling her, the king sends out a decree in search for another wife. And after the search, the king chooses a Jewish woman named Esther. Esther has been adopted by her uncle Mordecai, and both Esther and Mordecai are important characters. Duh, the book's named after her. But Mordecai learns that there's a plot to kill the king. And Mordecai tells the plot to Esther, who is now in a position of power as queen, and Esther warns the king. So the king is saved by Mordecai and Esther, and the event is recorded in the kingdom's records. This is important because later on, we'll get back to that. So soon the king promotes a guy named Haman to be his advisor and kind of right-hand guy. He's super important. Well, Haman has a bit of an ego problem. In his new position, the king commands everyone who sees Haman to bow down before him. Most people do, but Mordecai doesn't. It's an interesting thing here because the book of Esther doesn't really tell us why Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. We have to look at how our Jewish sisters and brothers interpret it. One interpretation is that Mordecai refused to bow because it would be a form of idolatry. Perhaps Haman was pretending to be a deity, and that would be blasphemous to bow before him. Another thought is that Haman was wearing a medallion or an image embroidered on his clothes that represented an idol. Thought of this way, Mordecai refused to bow because he would be bowing to the idol that Haman was wearing. But another interpretation comes from the Greek and Aramaic versions of the text, has Mordecai refusing to bow because bowing to a human instead of before God would be considered idolatry as well. A completely different interpretation has Mordecai refusing to bow before Haman because Haman is an Agite, a representation of Amalek who attacked the people as they fled from Egypt. Anyway, regardless of the interpretation we decide to go with, Mordecai refuses to bow, and Haman's ego is so hurt he wants to get revenge on Mordecai and the Jewish people. So Haman goes to the king and says that there's a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so it's not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it please the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who are in charge of the king's business, so that they may put it in the king's treasuries. That's in Esther chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. So the king agrees and basically signs an order for genocide against the Jewish people. Mordecai learns of this plot. It's clearly his thing, and he starts mourning. He tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes and walks around the city wailing. Esther's maids tell Esther about Mordecai and sends her assistant to find out why Mordecai is mourning like this. Mordecai tells them what's happening and tells Esther to go talk to the king to stop it from happening. There's a catch. There's a law that the king has made that if someone approaches the king without his invitation, they're to be killed immediately. So Esther is left with a choice: let the genocide happen or try to stop it and put herself at huge risk for approaching the king. In chapter 4, verse 13, Mordecai tells Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jewish people. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just a time as this." Esther, being the brave hero that she is, holds a banquet and approaches the king. The king motions her forward, which means he accepts what she's done and does not kill her. So the king says, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be given to you." Esther says that she wants Haman to attend the banquet with them, and the king agrees and Haman joins them. The king tells Esther again, "What is your petition? It should be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Esther replies, "If I have won the king's favor and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and I will do as the king has said." So Haman thinks that he's on top of the world. He has the king's favor. The queen's inviting him to her banquets. You could just see his ego grow even more and more. So Haman decides now is the time to take revenge on Mordecai specifically. So he plans to have Mordecai executed by hanging him. He orders a huge gallows to be constructed so he can kill Mordecai the next day. But that night, the king can't sleep. So to help him sleep, he orders one of his servants to read the records of the kingdom to him. Nothing like reading paperwork, right, to make you fall asleep. But in reading the records, they come across the time that Mordecai saved the king by sharing the plot to kill him that he discovered. So the king remembers and asks the servant if Mordecai had been rewarded for saving him. He hasn't. So the king calls in Haman and asks him, what should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor? Haman thinks that it's him that the king wants to honor and just starts making over-the-top declarations for how they should be honored. Haman says to the king, for the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden with royal crown on his head. Let the robes and horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square for the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done for the man who the king wishes to honor. The king agrees and tells Haman to do all that for Mordecai. Haman's super upset, but has to go to the banquet that Esther invites him to. So during the banquet, with Haman and the king sitting nearby, the king asks Esther what she wants from him again. This time Esther replies, if I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. The king demands to know who has done these things to her wife, to his wife and her beloved people. And Esther says, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. The king walks away and goes to the gardens. He's furious. Haman stays and begs for his life from Esther, to a point he even throws himself on the couch where she is sitting. And this is a huge no-no. The king returns to see Haman on the couch with his wife and orders Haman's execution on the same gallows that Haman built to kill Mordecai. So Haman's executed, and Haman's house and property all get given to Esther, who gives it to Mordecai. And Mordecai is given Haman's position as title and advisor and right-hand guy to the king. But the edict from the king still exists to kill the Jewish people. It can't be revoked. The king gives Mordecai authority to do whatever he can to fix the situation, other than taking back the king's order, because that would mean that the king made a mistake, and we can't admit that. So Mordecai writes a decree that the Jewish people in every place can defend themselves against anyone who that may try to destroy them. And they do. And the Jewish people are victorious in defending themselves throughout the country. And among those who attack them are Haman's 10 sons. They are defeated and they are captured. And Esther orders their execution and a feast to celebrate the victories over the people that were trying to wipe them out. This is where the Jewish festival of Purim comes from. One of the interesting things is that God is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther. How do you interpret God working in the story? What's your favorite part of the story? Why is it your favorite? My favorite verse in this book is when Mordecai tells Esther, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just a time as this. Put in modern language, perhaps the reason you are in this situation of power is so you can work good in it. Can you think of a time in your own life where you were able to make a good difference in a bad situation? Is this different from saying everything happens for a reason or God caused the situation because of God's plan? I think it's very different. I think that God works in the midst of bad situations, but doesn't specifically put bad things on humanity. We're good enough at doing that ourselves. I think God, being a loving and forgiving God, wants the best for us and helps guide us even in bad situations that humanity causes for itself. So thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.